Welcome to Why Jesus, where we give the Creator His dues. Today I wanted to talk to you about origin of life theory. I remember learning about spontaneous generation in college, as would many many people of my generation. So they taught us that in Australian classrooms, they taught us that spontaneous generation, the sudden appearance of life due to some godless particle or heat in the air, was bonkers, disproved. And then in the next lesson, I remember them telling us about how life arose spontaneously in the primordial soup. Now, this was a contradiction. I pointed it out to a classmate, and he was lost for words too. Okay, so we have a science history lesson in the famous swan neck flask experiment. Let's go back to that. So Louis Pasteur boiled some broth in flasks. This is in the late 19th century. He boils some broth in flasks with long spiraling necks designed to trap microscopic life from reaching the broth through the air. So at the moment in science, they're debating within themselves if spontaneous generation really is a thing. If there's this life heat or particle in the air that spontaneously generates life. So people were observing rats, fully grown rats, popping up out of sewage canals. They were observing maggots suddenly appearing out of apples, and flies being found on bread left outside. And the explanation for that was this life particle in the air, which was spontaneously producing these organisms. And so there were scientists on both camps who agreed or disagreed with this notion. So Louis Pasteur disagreed with it. Louis Pasteur is the father of germs and germs and application of study of microbes to all sorts of things like health. So he comes up with this experiment where he's bought some broth, and he's designed specific flasks for this experiment. They have these long curved necks. So the design of the neck of the flask is to prevent microbes in the air, microscopic organisms, from traveling through the neck of the flask into the broth and growing into something that we can see, like a maggot or a fly. And so he conducted the experiment, and what they found was that flies were not growing in these flasks, in these special flasks, in the beverage in these flasks. And it was because of the design of the flask, evidently. So it proved that it's not a live particle that was resulting in these flies in beverages and all of that. It was actually tiny flies, baby flies, being able to travel through the air into food or beverage. And he confirmed it by breaking off the necks of the flask. After he broke off the necks of the flask, and the flasks were regular flasks with openings, conducive for microbes to fall down through the air into the beverage. Flies started appearing in the beverages. So Louis Pasteur received the famous prize, scientific prize, because they were looking for scientists to come up with an experiment to settle the debate. So he received the prize, and science famously concluded that life only arises from life. Okay, and then fast forward a century, you have this theory, primordial soup. Lightning randomly hits mud, and because of the composition of that mud, a living, self-contained, self-reproducing thing arises. In other words, life spontaneously arising from non-life. Now, ironically, nobody up until that point had come out against Louis Pasteur or against specifically against Louis Pasteur, but for some reason science adopted this theory, and essentially it is spontaneous generation, as I explained. You've got life arising from non-life, so the environment, lightning hits mud spontaneously, and but you see, how can you prove something like that, disprove something like that? Because this alleged spontaneous generation event happened in the distant past, billions of years ago, somewhere. We don't know where exactly. We can only hypothesize. So science had morphed into extrapolative history. Instead of testing hypotheses about current phenomena and events, it had become a paradigm that sought to explain how present phenomena and events came to be in the first place, like history. Miller and Urey produced some amino acids in a test tube by running electricity through some water and gases in a test tube. But a bunch of floating proteins in a test tube, bunch of amino acids were produced. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. That's it. So you had a bunch of floating proteins in a test tube. Now I'll ask you a question. Is a bunch of floating proteins in a test tube a living organism? Clearly not. Yet science concluded that this happened. They thought it's ridiculous. Even the simplest living cell has an insulating osmotrophic exterior or membrane, which allows suitable amounts of nutrients like oxygen, water in, and allows suitable amounts of waste out of the cell. That's what I mean by self-containing. Not only that, but a simple living cell can reproduce because it contains a very special substance called nucleic acid, or DNA. DNA is the most informationally dense material currently known to man. It contains blueprints on how to create proteins. Now, the DNA in a simple living cell would have contained information on how to create the proteins it's already comprised of, because what is a cell? It's protein. Cellular membranes are protein. Could a random mindless function, like a sudden lightning strike of mud, just inanimate matter, mud, could it produce something like a living cell? Self-containing and self-reproducing? I don't think so. I agree with Louis Pasteur. Life only comes from life. And the first life must have come from something that had no beginning. In the beginning, God created.